Back in my ranking elements video, the order I settled on from worst to best was Geo, Pyro, Dendro, and Electro interchangeably, Cryo, Hydro, then Anemo, though in retrospect I might put Cryo in between Dendro and Electro since Dendro is way more broken than any of us likely anticipated. Having made a dedicated video talking about both Geo and Dendro, I thought it would be fun to make an episode on every element for the sake of continuity, bringing me to this video. The first year of Genshin was characterized by one element virtually dominating all aspects of the game through a multitude of circumstances. With the game's limited selection of characters, prevailing wisdom designated Pyro as one of, if not the strongest element in the game, a sentiment that continued all throughout version 1 and even early version 2. By version 3, as the game's roster was fleshed with more characters, players began to explore more teams and strategies that employed other elements, leading to extremely powerful combinations that didn't make use of Pyro whatsoever. What exactly happened to the Pyro element? Did we overrate how good it was? Is it still worthy of its previously held rank, or has it fallen off in value significantly? Let's find out. Without a doubt, the element that received the most attention early on in Genshin was Pyro. Not only were 3 of its 4 initial units, Diluc, Bennett, and Xiangling, really strong relatively speaking, but the element in tandem with Cryo took up most of version 1's release lineup. Version 1.0 had Klee, 1.1 oversaw Child and Diona as well as Zhongli and Xinyan, 1.2 featured Ganyu and Albedo, 1.3 had Hu Tao and Xiao, 1.4 had Rosaria, 1.5 had Yanfei and Eula, 1.6 had Kazuha, and even version 2 had Sayu, Yoimiya, and Ayaka. 5 out of the first 16 new units consisted of Pyro, adding onto the 4 existing ones for a total of 9. Before we were even 1 year into Genshin Impact, Pyro was far outstripping the other elements in size. For comparison, prior to version 2, Hydro still only had Xingqiu, Child, Mona, and Barbara, less than half of Pyro, while Geo only had Zhongli, Noelle, Ningguang, and Albedo. Experience-wise, it wasn't a poor design decision. The effective strength of elements like Electro and Anemo weren't as conspicuous as that of Pyro on account of their reactions being less effective at the time and the increased demand for certain characters to actually tap into that strength. Pyro, on the other hand, was very straightforward, still is today. Seeing as fire often represents power in video games, its units were designed to run inflicting and or supplementing huge amounts of damage for their party. Most of the casts are designated as on-field damage dealers like Hu Tao, Yoimiya, Diluc, Klee, Yanfei, and technically Xinyan. In Xinyan's case, the 2 people who actually use her field her as a support purely because she's so inefficient as an on-field damage dealer. The focus on damage is further exemplified through Pyro's system mechanics, mainly its resonance and reactions. Having 2 Pyro units passively boosts the attack of the entire party by 25%. Considering our primitive understanding of the game at that time, it seemed like Pyro was a no-brainer in terms of maximizing DPS, a sentiment that was reinforced by the element's premier reactions, Vaporize and Melt. Chaining the 2 elements together, depending on the order, would result in the triggering attack's damage being multiplied by 1.5 times or outright doubled, and if you remember that Pyro units were already specialized in dealing huge amounts of damage, the answer was clear as day. Another major contributor to Pyro's early dominance was how easy it was to reach their maximum strength. Mind you, players were quick to figure out more sophisticated team compositions from day 1. But looking at the average casual or semi-hardcore player, Pyro seemed like, once again, a no-brainer. All you needed was Pyro and Hydro or Pyro and Cryo, and those 2 elements were also very accessible. Cryo was the second most stacked roster in the game, featuring Rosaria, Diona, Ganyu, Kaya, Chongyun, and Qiqi. Chances are you are guaranteed to have at least one of them, if not multiple, allowing you to pull off a melt or reverse melt combo very easily. As for Hydro, although its selection was far less varied, everyone had Barbara and Xingqiu, the latter being one of the most overpowered units in the game. Xingqiu's Rain Cutter essentially allowed for any Pyro on-fielded to achieve Vaporize without ever having to swap out, instantly making units like Hu Tao, Diluc, Yoimiya, Klee, and Yanfei deal tons of damage. Only 2 units were needed, requiring less upfront investment than early meta teams like Freeze or Taser. So in a way, Pyro's initial success was purely circumstantial. It was and is the simplest element in the game to understand and was given the most attention early on. That, alongside our narrow understanding of the game causing us to prioritize big dig damage, made a lot of players believe Pyro was the best element in the game. That wasn't entirely false though. Transformative reactions like Electrocharge, Overload, and Swirl were noticeably weaker back then. It wasn't until the tail end of version 1 when they were substantially buffed. Additionally, knowing that elemental reactions come with an internal cooldown implicitly suggested that, at least for amplifying reactions, a single powerful blow was better than death by 1,000 cuts because not all of those 1,000 cuts would be powered up. Lastly, while this isn't really tied with the element, 3 of the game's most powerful units are not only Pyro but were also available to us at the start of the game, which is very significant. Most players pursue comfort over maximum efficiency, especially in games that don't pressure them to innovate or seek out better options. I know this is anecdotal and not reflective of everyone's experience, but even though we now have so many ways to nuke the entire screen with damage, I still find myself going right in National in Spiral Abyss because of how easy it is to use. Is it the most efficient? Not necessarily, but it doesn't have to be. I can still perfect clear while turning my brain off. Case in point, I'm lazy, as I'm sure the majority of players are. Tao and Xiangling were the first two universally employed 5-star main DPS units in Genshin Impact. It also helps that they're very autopilotable characters. In Tao's case, pairing her with Xingqiu makes her a very easy 1-2 combination. By extension, Bennett and Xiangling are also very easy to use, apply to a lot of situations, and don't cost a lot to invest in. Obviously, there's a subset of players who really enjoy pushing characters to their absolute limit, theorizing all the best builds, combinations, rotations, what have you, and I'm like that too, just not in this game. Unlike other games, Genshin doesn't challenge you enough to go down that path. Tao, Bennett, and Xiangling have still maintained an iron grip on the meta to this day for how effective and, more importantly, familiar they are to use. For players who lack the wherewithal to pull for every character in the game, that made Pyro a very appealing choice compared to other teams or elements that mandated several 5-stars. Fast forward to late 2022, and the playing field was drastically altered. Aside from Yoimiya, version 2 featured no other Pyro characters, understandably choosing to add more to the other elements rosters, particularly Hydro, Geo, and Electro, 3 elements that were in desperate need of more representation. The increased variety and selection granted more opportunities for players to explore other options. Due to this, we've had greater improvements to teams like the National, swapping out Chongyun for Shogun. Freeze teams got a major boost in efficiency thanks to Ayaka, Kokomi, and Shunhe, Taser as well. Even not so prevalent options like Mono Geo began to surface with the advent of Goro, Ito, and Yunjin. We're now in a position where every element, sans Dendro, has enough characters that cover a wide range of functions. More importantly, common knowledge of Genshin has advanced. While still a minority, information that was extensively and exhaustively compiled by theory crafters is now more readily available for public use, and even casual players have gradually weaned off the notion that crit rate, crit damage, and big number screenshots were the be-all end-all. Well, except for a certain player base that feverishly copes on their waifu one day claiming her rightful place on the throne. No, but seriously, in a manner of speaking, Genshin has experienced a paradigm shift. New characters being released for the other elements allowed us to figure out what more of said elements had to offer, and as Genshin's combat continued to evolve, so too did the meta. All of this, however, came at the expense of the general public's declining opinion of Pyro. For those of you who are patient enough to still be watching to this point, let me clarify something. The video thumbnail has the word overrated on it, a term that's often used to imply something is not as good as everyone makes it out to be. For something to be overrated though, it has to already be held in high regard. For example, we can't say Geo is an overrated element when it was never good to begin with. Likewise, I'm not saying Pyro is a bad element, merely that the community's initial perceptions of it may have been too generous, though that's not in any way our fault. Once again, Pyro's early success had a lot to do with circumstance, such as a lack of competition and conventional wisdom on what is effective in video games, specifically gachas. We basically had a honeymoon phase with Pyro. While Pyro still employs many strong units, the element itself has been placed in question on whether it's better or worse than what we have now. It's still portrayed as the big damage element, but we now know there are more ways to deal damage than just one giant number. The decline of Pyro's status as the #1 element began shortly after version 2's release, namely because outside of the big 3 and maybe Yoimiya, the others were really starting to fall off in relevance. Diluc and Klee were very strong at the start, but their selfish moveset and lackluster scaling led to them getting power creeped to some degree. Furthermore, Pyro went from being the element with the most growth to the element with the least. Yoimiya was brought to us on August 10, 2021. It's been over a year since we got a new Pyro character. Meanwhile, Electro has ironically become the fastest growing element and also has the largest roster at 12. Not saying that all of its new units are super broken, but more characters means more attention. Then again, much of that attention has to do with Dendro, not so much Electro. I'm aware we have Dia, who's expected to become playable at some point or another, seeing as she's a character with a unique model and not a generic NPC. But as of making this video, no word of her announcement is scheduled to us yet, and even then, she's a 4-star Pyro character, not a 5-star, which brings me to the biggest problem with Pyro as an element. I talked about this in Toma's Why No One Plays episode, but MiHoYo sort of shot themselves in the foot with how they went about Pyro's characters, in that they set the bar for Pyro so unreasonably high from day one. Bennett and Xiangling comprise 2 out of the holy trinity of 4 stars, Bennett, Xiangling, and Xingqiu, 3 characters who by all accounts should have been 5 stars if we go by how ridiculously overpowered they are. Then Tao was released, a tanky bruiser who is honestly way overtuned for her time. This means that every new Pyro unit who comes out will be automatically compared to them. If they're Pyro on-field DPS, they'll have to somehow be able to match or outperform Tao. If they're Pyro off-field DPS, they'll have to deal with Xiangling. Pyro supports may have a chance to shine since Bennett, despite being a support, isn't really a Pyro support unless you open Constellation 6. He's more of a everything support. That's another issue with Pyro, it's the element of power, or in other words, it's all about damage. The problem with damage is that every element can do damage now, so it comes down to what else can be provided. For instance, animal-related comps are able to supply crowd control and team support boosts. Team compositions are no longer solely evaluated on the basis of how much damage they deal, but how comfortably and efficiently they can do so. Chain Freeze isn't even the highest in damage, but when you're able to perma-stun everything, what difference does it make? Pyro and its units currently offer nothing but damage, but that's not in short supply in this day and age. You might be wondering why new Pyro characters will be compared to Bennett, Tao and Xiangling 1-to-1 when characters like Sucrose and Kazuha are both widely used, even though they have much of the same premise. That's because Pyro is an element all about numbers. Remember, its premier reactions are Vaporize and Melt. Perhaps Burgeon, but if you plan on going Burgeon, you might as well go Hyper Bloom at that point. The only measure of how efficient a Pyro DPS is depends on how strong their burst damage is through Vaporize or Melt. Xiangling gets to play around in reaction-focused comps, but Xiangling is very much the exception. She carries through sheer numbers and Snapshot. Doing that can be difficult to pull off without outright making a stronger version of any of the three. That's the issue. The first wave of Pyro characters was so good that the only way new Pyro units will be used is if they blatantly power creep those three. But if you try to power creep 3 of the best characters in the game, you're gonna power creep everything. This puts miHoYo in a very difficult position. Pyro is facing a diversity crisis, or lack thereof. There are a bunch of quote-unquote okay units, and a handful of super big ones that are too strong and too general for there to be any incentive for you to use okay units for reasons other than personal attachment. Essentially, Pyro is only kept in relevance because of how good the characters are, similarly to Geo but not to the same extent. The element currently has no top-tier Pyro-centric team at the moment. The only one that comes close is Double Hydro, combining Xingqiu and Yelan with Tao, Xiangling, or Yoimiya, but that only works by virtue of Xingqiu and Yelan working so well together. It's funny, in my exclusive support video, someone made a comment saying that Genshin's biggest mistake was Bennett, and I would have to agree. Bennett has virtually removed all possibility of there being another good Pyro support because what he does is everything a Pyro support should do, that the only way we can get another Pyro support is if they're literally a second Bennett. Kinda like how they did with Yelan having an elemental burst with the same basic principle as Xingqiu. They tried Toma, but even if the latter's numbers were more generous, Pyro is not really meant to set up reactions, it's meant to trigger them. Bennett's Swiss Army Knife Elemental Burst simultaneously takes care of offensive and defensive augmentation, while Xiangling and Tao take care of the DPS side of things. miHoYo made Pyro's early characters so powerful and versatile that I genuinely believe they're holding off on releasing new Pyro units until the other elements power creep enough to where they can release a stronger Bennett, Tao, or Xiangling without everyone losing their minds. Credit where credit is due, they tried to make Pyro more than just big damage by creating Burgeon, allowing someone like Toma to find success in spite of being in the shadow of Bennett. But that's just not enough. miHoYo decided to make the most all-purpose characters in the one element where they shouldn't have done that, as in if Bennett was Hydro or Xiangling was Cryo, they probably wouldn't be as ridiculously broken as they are for Pyro. But since Pyro is such a low-maintenance element, they take care of everything for you, preventing any semblance of niche or specialized characters from ever being thought of as anything other than a less efficient version of Bennett or Xiangling. I know I might have made this sound a bit more pessimistic than it really should be. Pyro is objectively still a very powerful element, and by no means are you making a mistake by choosing it as your favorite. But it's interesting to see how what was once the holy grail of Genshin Impact is now arguably the second weakest element in the game. Although you can see this as a blessing, it's nice that 2 of the 3 best Pyro units happen to be really accessible to everyone, so while they scoot over the element's balance, at the very least we don't have to burn our walls to make the most of it. That being said, I still think Klee had the best shot at being another good Pyro support if she was designed as a support, not DPS. But what do you guys think? Do you believe there's a possibility we can see a resurgence for Pyro without power creeping, or do you agree with me and that's stuck in a catch-22? Feel free to share in the comments down below. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe, I really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Varsrem, join my Discord server, and check out my videos on Geo and Dendro if you haven't yet. Until next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.